to yet another live session for Open Branding Month with Rebels and Rulers. As some of you know, this is kind of our let's say translation of what would have been, another great physical event, but given the fact that we can't necessarily do that, we thought what better way than to give as many people worldwide the chance to interact with our speakers, to see what they have to say, and to ask their questions. So thank you for joining. Really, today we have Dominik here with us, and he's some of you might know that he was, quite a lead man at Interbrand, but now he works for a really cool boutique consulting company in New York called cg42, and he's a partner there. So welcome, Dom.
Hi. Nice. Thanks for having me yet again. It's always great.
Of course. You guys might also know him obviously from Branding Mag. He has quite a great series on there with really, really big brand leaders. It's called Don't Panic. So definitely, if you haven't checked it out, you should. It's really nice. So now I have my questions for Dom, as always. I have my questions prepared, but if you guys have any questions along the way, please send them. Don't hesitate. Don't wait until the end. Just send them either through the Q&A in the Zoom or in the chat on Facebook, and I'll make sure to introduce as many of them as I can throughout the session. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So Dominik, during your presentation, you actually mentioned quite an interesting, I would say, piece of data, which was that 80% of companies believe they are delivering a superior customer experience, but only 8% of their customers on average agree. I mean, it was a huge discrepancy then. I don't know how much it has changed now, but I think it doesn't necessarily matter as much. I'm sure the gap didn't close that significantly. So why do you think that such a gap exists between, let's say, what companies think they're doing and what customers are actually feeling them doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me throw a question back at you, Flavia, to kind of explain why that's the case.
Okay.
Simple yes or no. Let's get into it, right? Do you think you are a good driver?
Oh, hell yeah.
Great. So for everyone on this call, on the live stream, let me actually tell you the truth. So I can say this because I sat on the passenger seat in her car driving around Bucharest in Romania.
Oh my God, no.
And I can tell you, Flavia is not a great driver. I think at some point, I think we ran an old lady off the road. So Flavia is not a great driver, but here she is, and she's very convinced that she actually is. And there's been a great psychologist, David Dunning, and he once said, people overestimate themselves, but even more than that, they really seem to believe it. So this is a perfect example, and it actually goes back to some of the numbers I put up on the screen during the presentation. People tend to think of themselves and their capabilities normally in higher regard than, maybe some of their capabilities are. It's very human. Like, we like to talk about the things we're good at, our accomplishments, but then sometimes reality looks a little different. And I think that's very much the case when you compare, how businesses, and remember, businesses are run by people, when they state that they're doing exceptionally well when it comes to customer experience, but the real customers who are going through it each and every day might not actually really experience it just that way. So I think there's a bit of an overstatement, and over exaggeration a little bit in evaluating your own capabilities versus your customers. And then the second thing I would say is, I think one of the mistakes I see brands and companies make sometimes when they think about their own customer experience is they compare it to other competitors in their category, right? So they're like, hey, we're a big brand in the financial services space, and our service experience is so much better than what our competitor, this other bank provides. Well, the problem with that is, if that's true, that's not how your customers compare your experience to that of others, because I might compare the service experience I'm getting with my bank to the experience I'm getting with Amazon or a great hotel I stayed at the other day. And if you compare those experiences, then probably the hotel experience might win out compared to the one I had with my bank. which then actually leads to the fact that a lot of customers say, you know what, your service experience isn't that great.
Okay. We're gonna have to talk about that driving thing, though. I think there needs to be some context set on this situation, because we're talking about a German and a Romanian, and if you know anything about how people drive in Romania, it's not necessarily. Anyways, I will stop there. Okay, so if we draw this parallel between the company side and the human side, then I think, you know, given that your presentation was about vulnerability, nobody wants to talk about that as people, you know, nobody wants to accept that any more than they want to accept that they're not good drivers. So I'm wondering why should anyone in the business world sit there and think about vulnerability? I mean, and you touched a little bit about this, but I'd like to hear it from you now, and even thinking about what I saw in the presentation, maybe even in my head compare a little bit, maybe how you talked about it then to how you talk about it now, and see if it has changed at all.
Yeah, so I think that's a great point, right? Like, why would anyone want to talk about vulnerability, which seems a bit like a mushy concept in the world of business? And I think I would go back a little bit to, most of you might be familiar with Brené Brown, who is a great psychologist, and she's very popular in this space talking about vulnerability right now and why leaders specifically of businesses need to talk about it. And she said something that really stuck with me one day. She said, you know what, vulnerability is actually, it's not about weaknesses or weakness, you know, and that myth is profoundly dangerous to see it that way, because, you know, vulnerability really is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. And I think that is the principle and the belief that we adopted, and we do work with businesses, and we said we need to inject the thinking and the concept and the philosophy behind vulnerability into the world of business. And the reason why that's important is, even though it's uncomfortable to look at your vulnerabilities, it is incredibly important, because everything that is better stems from acknowledging where you're vulnerable in the first place, you know. And I think that's true for all of us on an individual level, quite frankly. You know, if you want to grow as a person, you have to start from a place of where you're maybe not great right now. And that's, you know, kind of like that lights the fire for creating something better and for innovating, which is part of the reason why we very strongly believe that we need to go into businesses and start asking some different questions. And the question shouldn't be, you know, how many of your customers are satisfied? That's great to know, but it's not necessarily super helpful. So we believe in going in and starting to ask questions like, what are your customers most frustrated with? What do your customers hate about the experience with you? You know, what are the biggest pain points your customers experience with you? So collectively, like, where are you most vulnerable as a brand and as a business? Because if we can put our finger on that, we can actually help you get to a much better place where maybe your customers don't necessarily want to leave you because they're frustrated. So the idea here really is to identify where you're vulnerable, but then make you less vulnerable in the process, because we actually help you get to a better place as a business and as a brand.
So then the potential backlash there can be, I think, maybe twofold. So one I think, which maybe we can talk about first is, and maybe you have some ideas around how to avoid this, which is people being pinpointed for why things have gone wrong, you know, because once you identify a very big issue, I'm not going to say somebody has to be held accountable, but companies do act like somebody has to be held accountable. So do you have any recommendations around that? I mean, great. There might be some people, you know, that really want to adopt this thinking. But I think that's the first fear that they might have. And then I'll ask you about the second one afterwards.
Yeah, you raise a fantastic point, and I think it's probably one of the challenges we run into sometimes, you know, when we introduce this methodology into, or this type of discussion into companies, because it's easy to immediately try to point fingers and be like, okay, now we found out what's not necessarily working. Let's turn the page and look for the person who is responsible for that experience, and, like, you know, follow up with that person. And people get scared about that stuff because, you know, people's careers are involved, and, you know, their competency and reputation is on the line. So one thing that we do at the very beginning, whenever a company starts to work with us on something like this, is we make it very clear that this is not about pointing fingers. It's not about casting blame. It's not about going back in time and, you know, trying to figure out why things went wrong in the first place. The whole perspective we're taking on is to say, hey, look, we're going into this with the intent to improve, with the intent to innovate, you know, with the intent to become better. And, you know, to be human means to be imperfect. So not everyone in the company has probably done everything in a perfect way. And that's fine, you know, but we're here to really get a little closer to things being perfect. And it's a much more collaborative, positive, optimistic approach than casting blame. And setting the tone like that is really important, because we have no desire or interest to go into an organization and point fingers.
And do you think they stick to that? Because I'm assuming that having something like okay, let's all agree that no matter what happens through this process, nobody's getting fired. You know, like setting those kind of like very practical, clear barriers to what can happen. I don't know. Do you think that the clients actually stick to that, no matter how well, you know, you set the tone, you do the project, but perhaps sometimes it lingers. And I'm just wondering if people really stick to that.
It could, you know, I think our point of view in that case is if something is incredibly wrong within the organization, if somebody, a department, or, you know, somebody who's in a position of affecting how customers feel about your brand or business is doing something that really upsets customers, that'll like hit the light of day at some point. Anyway, true. You know, it's not like you can keep it under the rug and under the cover. So we might expose some of those things a little earlier, which by the way is great, because the earlier you detect some of the pain points, the earlier you can attend to them and fix them. It's kind of like, you know, going to a doctor and you like have a little bit of an ache. So it's good to do the diagnosis and get into physical therapy early, as opposed to waiting, you know, up to a point where you can't fix it anymore. So I think there's a bit of a give and take between, of course, people need to pull into the same direction as we believe we need to go. We try to keep it constructive as much as we can. But again, you know, some of these things would have hit the light of day at some point anyway.
Okay. And then the other fear that I think people might have is that if you ask people what they hate about what you're doing, then you're drawing attention to what they hate about what you're doing. So how do you offset some of that? Because I'm assuming that might be some of the the pushback that you get from these leaders as well is, well, I don't want to draw attention to what they hate, you know, I'd rather just focus. It's like, is there any other way to identify it? Well, it's kind of difficult to identify it any other way though, but I'm wondering how you deal with that part of the fear.
Yeah, so I get it, right? What I would always say is if people are aware of what they hate about your experience, you know, they are already
then it's happening all the time anyways.
It's already happened, right? So that's one thing. I think the other thing I would say is in the studies that we could conduct, we have a proprietary methodology for this. We normally don't ask these questions about, you know, what are you frustrated with or what's your biggest pain point in the experience about one particular company only, but we include a whole set of other competitors. So that does two things, right? First of all, whoever is responding to these surveys and some of the research we're doing is they don't necessarily get into a mindset of, oh, this is about, I don't know, let's say, oh, this is about Apple only. They get questions around Apple and Samsung and, you know, Motorola and any other player in that space. So they can't really necessarily pinpoint if this is something particular for the one client that we might be serving in the moment, but they talk about the players in the category. So that's distributes the blame a little bit, but it also, by the way, for the brands we're doing this for, has a lot of added value because you learn about your own vulnerabilities and you learn about the vulnerabilities of your competition, which can prove to be really, really helpful, because if you know why customers are upset over here, you can probably design something for them that helps them maybe come over to your side because you're offering them a better experience than anyone else in your category.
So then what about in terms of company size? Is this for everyone? Is it applied differently between big and small companies? What are some of your thoughts there?
My answer to that is very simple. Like, this discussion needs to happen in every single company on the planet. Like, seriously, like if you
I
have
agree. I
one,
think it was eye-opening when you first talked to me about it a little while back as well. So
because first of all, it gets you into a rhythm. Like, you train a muscle of engaging with this type of question. And as you maybe, if you're a small company today and you get into the rhythm of things like that, you learn it as you grow. And even for big companies, obviously, it's very important. So I would say everyone needs to think about their vulnerabilities. It's incredibly important. And I think, sometimes the smallest companies are best at it. And a lot of the companies that you've seen emerge over the last couple of maybe 2-3 years, the challenger brands, they are fantastic at it, because what they do is they spot vulnerabilities of big companies, and then they build and design experiences or an entire business model off of those vulnerabilities. Let me give you maybe a few examples. Casper, the mattress company, when they first started out, they knew that the experience of going out into the world to buy a mattress is one of the most horrific things you might ever want to experience. You go to some basement store, then there's kind of a shady salesperson who's like pushing you into buying a mattress you don't really want or need. So they totally redesigned that experience and made it much, much better. And, they were born out of a vulnerability they identified in the category. And it's very similar for, new online pharmacies like Capsule, right? Who take away a lot of the pain points that you have in getting your prescription medicine, or Lemonade, which is a small brand in the insurance space, who literally redesigned their entire experience based on how horrible it is for most people in the category. I don't know a single person who's in deep, passionate love with their insurance company. Most people we run into are like kind of frustrated with the experience. It's hard, it's complicated, there's always a bit of pain point in there. And Lemonade took that on and said, we're going to totally redesign this and make it pleasant and enjoyable for customers. And the only way they could do that is because they understood the biggest vulnerabilities and frustrations in that space.
Okay. So then there isn't necessarily like a right time to do this. It's not like if you're new or if you're old or if there's a certain thing that you couple it with, or, it's valid all the time.
Yeah, the best time to start to think about your vulnerabilities is yesterday. And I'm serious. Like, I think if you wait up to a point where you as a business owner or, a CMO in a big company become aware of your vulnerabilities, I bet you that your customers were aware of the exact same ones months or years ago. So you don't really want to wait to a point where you think you have a problem. This is something you want to explore all the time, because it takes some time to bubble to the surface. And once it's there, in most cases, it's too late.
And then when it comes to specificity, how specific do you have to be when you're going into, do you have to pick a certain area? I'm thinking about larger organizations, do you have to pick a certain area? Do you have to pick, how specific do you have to be in terms of, because I'm assuming you can't just ask, people, what are your biggest problems with
Right.
me?
Yeah, you're right. So I think the best way to illustrate that is maybe with an example. As
Sure.
you said, big companies have, a lot of different types of customers. They have a lot of different types of products, and you can't necessarily just ask or expect that one customer can respond and talk about all of the experience, right? Like, let's take a car brand, like let's say Mercedes-Benz.
Okay.
So Mercedes-Benz has a lot of different cars, and they have commercial vehicles and personal vehicles. And sometimes with big companies, we do this type of exploration and research in a specific product area. So maybe they come back to us and say, hey, look, you know what, the E-Class is one of our most important models. So we don't want to do it for all of our products, but we do want to understand how customers that tend to buy that type of vehicle feel about their experience with us, So you can do it for one specific product. And even within a product, we could do it for a specific aspect of it. So for example, we do this for automotive companies who are particularly interested these days in maybe the in-car technology of the vehicle and whether that's working for people or not, or if their experience with in-car technology is much better, you know, with BMW or, you know, you name it, right? So it can be a product, or it can even be an aspect of a product. That's how specific you can get with this. And sometimes it's really important to be that specific, because you might want to address like a very specific issue you're facing.
Okay, so it can go, well, I'll ask this after my next question, but can you tell me then a little bit about the actual research process and how that works? I mean, quantitative, qualitative, balance between the two, more of one than the other. Maybe give some hints. I'm thinking that maybe some people would really like to apply this to a certain degree. So I think any light you can shed on how would be really great.
Yes. What I'll tell you that, so we have developed a methodology for this that is proprietary and actually patent pending. So we're getting a patent for it. So here's what I'll do. I'll treat this a little bit like my grandmother's favorite cake recipe. Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about it, but I can't give you all of the ingredients, right? She wouldn't do that. So I'll give you, like, in broad strokes, kind of what we normally do. So I think the most important thing to recognize is that we're talking about people here and how people feel, and, you know, where people feel frustrated or have pain points. So what we normally do is we spend a lot of time with people. So when something like this comes up, there's a lot of qualitative research we do. You know, we do ethnographies, we spend time with people in their life to really understand and talk to them about their experience, because some of these things run really deep and people need to articulate, you know, what some of their biggest frustrations are. And we use a lot of the learnings that we get from that, a lot of the insights, to then inform a bit what normally ends up being a really big, solid quantitative research study. So within the quantitative research, like I said a little earlier, we ask people a lot about the different frustrations in their experience, and we do it for the brand that is working with us, but we also do it for all of the competitors, right? So it's a pretty sophisticated study. And what normally happens or comes out of that is we really identify what the biggest pain points are for customers. And on top of that, we also, and this is very helpful for companies, we start to quantify what that means financially for the company we work for. So what I mean by that is, if we know that coming out of the study that 25% of your customers are extremely frustrated with something that might inch them a little closer to wanting to switch to another brand if this is not being fixed, and we know, let's say, the average value, monetary value a customer brings to the table, then we can get to a number that we can, you know, discuss in a boardroom with the CEO, the CFO, and say, hey, look, 25% of your customers you are vulnerable of losing 25% of your customers. And if that happens, right, then you might stand to lose X amount of revenue, which is an incredibly important part of the discussion, because just coming in with, hey, your customers are frustrated with X, Y, Z is insightful, but it doesn't always lead to a real sense of urgency that we need to actually go do something. If you hold up a number and say, hey, this is what we're talking about, this is what's at stake, then you see people jump into action a little bit quicker. And sometimes that's very, very helpful. Yeah,
I can imagine. So then once you go through that process and you kind of have the results, what do you do with them? What can it actually affect? What steps do you take then, once you've actually identified where you're vulnerable?
Yeah, a few really important decisions happen right after, because I think one thing that is important to point out is we don't expect, and no one should expect, that you take the results and you all of a sudden are aware of maybe 21 frustrations your customers have, that you need to go and fix all of them immediately and at the same time, right? It's absolutely not necessary. So what we then go into actually is an exercise that talks about, okay, let's look at this in the context of even your competition. And let's see which are the biggest frustrations and which of them should we actually prioritize and why. So we get to a point where we say, okay, there are a couple of things in the experience that customers have with you where we basically just need to get up to par with the rest of your competition, because yes, people are frustrated, but they don't really, it doesn't have a massive impact on whether they leave or don't leave, but we need to get at least to a level where your competition is, right? So let's do that. There are a couple of other frustrations in here that we can probably ignore. You know, people, yes, they're a little frustrated, but it doesn't really affect their behavior much. But then there might be some others where we significantly lag the competition, where we know people will leave and switch over to another brand if this persists. And then we can focus attention onto those, right? So it's massively helpful to prioritize where you need to invest. That is one thing. And then the other thing that is extremely helpful is, as we're looking at, you know, all of the insights and pain points, we normally have an opportunity to identify opportunities where we might even be able to design and create entirely new products or services, because we learn a lot throughout the process. And people might tell us, oh, you know what, at the time when I walk, let's say this is for a pharmacy, right? And they're like, I always have to go to the pharmacy, and then I have to deal with the long lines, and then I have to wait there, and I have a cold, I don't want to be outside. So we can then start to identify services that we can offer as a pharmacy brand to maybe get rid of that part of the experience entirely and start a 12-hour express shipping service, for example, right? And we might find out that people are actually willing, maybe they would pay for that, right? For the convenience of having that. So now we have maybe a new service that can be monetized, right? That makes the experience dramatically better. So that's another massive benefit of talking about your vulnerabilities, because you might stumble across things that empower you to redesign parts of your business.
Do you have some good examples of where you've seen this working well, this process? Anything that you can talk about?
Yeah, you know what, I think there is. Let me talk about 3 quick examples that I mentioned in the presentation for anyone who has, you know, watched the video. So there are 3 types normally of examples. I think there's this one type of companies that figures out what their own vulnerabilities are, like what's wrong with our experience, like why are we losing customers and market share. And Domino's, for example, was one of those examples. For those of you who are familiar with Domino's, it's a massive pizza fast food chain. And a couple of years ago, they lost a lot of customers, and they went deep into understanding where they were vulnerable. Like pizza, people hated the pizza, the delivery experience was terrible, and they entirely redesigned their entire customer journey based on the findings, and now they're massively successful. So that's one example of a brand who leveraged their own vulnerabilities to get better. The second example is, I would say, T-Mobile, and that one is a little different because they used an understanding of category vulnerabilities to reposition their brand within it. So they understood really well that everyone kind of hates their mobile phone provider. You know, it's like everyone always complains and people switch around and they always feel taken advantage of, and their prices are too high, like all that stuff. So they built an entire positioning of the uncarrier on the frustrations of the category. So it massively helped them with their brand positioning. So they found a unique space, and very successful today. And then the third example I would say is, for example, take Airbnb. Like they understood when they founded the business what an entire industry, the entire hospitality industry had massive vulnerabilities. Like prices were high in hotels, you know, like you need to find this space you might not even be comfortable with. So they built an entire business on the notion of, we're actually going to provide a solution to this that is cheaper, the experience is more personal and better, and it helped them to really design the business from the ground up. So there's different types of ways in which you can use, you know, an understanding of your vulnerabilities or the categories that can be very, very empowering to the way you design and run your business.
And then once you've decided to do this, you've done the research, you've gotten the results, how do you actually propagate that inside an entire organization and kind of make sure that people come along for the journey, that they're convinced that it's a good idea, you know, and maybe what are some of the pitfalls of that you've seen where organizations maybe get it wrong right at the point of change and of implementation of change?
Yeah. Oh my God, where do I start? So I think the single biggest pitfall to avoid with this type of stuff is to keep it in a silo, right? Because sometimes a request from a company to dive really deep into your frustrations and vulnerability comes from a specific department. Let's say the CMO, or maybe the chief digital officer comes to us and asks us for an understanding, like or product manager, for a specific product. The risk is that the knowledge and the things we learn then lives just there. And the problem with that is if you don't pull in every other part of the organization, finance, operations, sales, then your chances of actually doing something useful with what you've learned are very, very slim. Because, I mean, how complex organizations are. In order to change something over here, you now need people from every other department to make it happen. So we put a lot of emphasis on making sure that at the very beginning, we bring in as many people as possible across different functions and really get them excited about the prospect of what we're doing here. Again, right, like figuring out opportunities to grow, to make people's lives better, to make our customers happier. That's a very optimistic outset, and prospect. And really bringing people together is incredibly important because you can't do it alone, and looping in people early creates a sense of, hey, we're in this together, we're going to do this. And people tend to get really excited by what's on the other end of, of vulnerabilities.
So then you don't necessarily need it to sit at the level of a CEO in order for this to function. I mean, it can be kind of like a quote unquote groundswell to a certain extent of various functions, or do you always need top management to also be there?
At some point we do. So it doesn't have to start there. We'd love for it to start there, right? Because if these type of things are supported from the top down, that's very helpful. At some point, you need somebody who can bring in and pull in some of the weight, because on the other end of all of this, like we talked about a little earlier, we will need to make some decisions on what are we going to go do, right? And the moment you do something, you need to fund it and you need to invest in something. And sometimes these investments are significant because there's significant value to gain, right? Like you don't lose customers, you gain new customers. So the investments required sometimes require C-suite to be part of the process, because someone's got to sign the check, as they say.
Can you give us an idea of what the incremental value of doing this actually can be, of upping your customer experience? Do you have some numbers that you can set against customer satisfaction versus?
Yes. So let me start by saying this. I think there's always value in reducing friction and pain points and a horrible experience. And just to be honest, just making everyone's life just a little easier and more enjoyable, for your customers, but even for your employees. Like the moment there is fewer frustrations on your customer side, normally when you work at that company, your life gets a little easier too, because you don't have to deal with so many complaints. So that is worthwhile in itself. I think from a financial perspective, the research firm Forrester, they did a lot of those type of studies, and they actually found that if you increase the customer satisfaction, let's say in the automotive industry, by 1%, and you are a global automotive company, what you can gain from that on the other end is more than $1 billion in extra revenue.
Jesus.
So obviously this varies, depending on where you are and what you do, but just to give you a feel for the scope of what's possible, it's significant. And the way you get to that amount is like your customers don't switch, right? So you don't lose revenue, but you also design new experiences and services that bring in your revenue, or you capture some of the customers from your competitors because you now understand what you need to do to provide a better experience that could convince some of them to maybe come over, and buy things from you. So it's incredibly powerful. Like, we did one project with a big bank in the United States called Union Bank, and we helped them to redesign their banking experience. And for them, it created double-digit growth for over 24 months. So, you know, it can lead to significant benefits for a business.
You mentioned, and it's good that you brought it up, but you mentioned employees. So do you see a lot of companies applying the same thinking and the same methodology internally and what is the, you know, what is the value of doing so? Would you suggest it in the first place? Does one does one come before the other also? It's like, what do you have to solve first? Your internal issues or your external?
You can see, like, I'm getting very excited because I'm so glad. I'm
but
so
I'm glad.
You know, no, I'm so glad you're asking the question because, you know, honestly, very often, for whatever reason, we tend to forget about the employees who make a lot of the stuff happen, right? That customers experience. So yes, we take employee vulnerability very, very seriously for two reasons. One is, obviously, in itself, there's a war for talent, right? Like, when you look at turnover in companies, like companies losing employees, I think collectively, I think the annual turnover cost for US companies, according to Gallup, is $1 trillion a year.
You're
right?
kidding.
Because yes, you have to recruit people, you have to train them again, you lose institutional knowledge, like it creates a massive problem for companies, especially today. So there is incredible value in understanding where maybe even the experience for your employees is bad, because if you fix it, you can avoid a lot of those, quite frankly, those costs, right?
Yeah.
So that is one thing. Then the other reason why it's important to understand the vulnerability of your employees is they are the ones that deliver the customer experience, right? So those two things are also connected. And if there are places where employees are frustrated because maybe they aren't empowered to deliver a great service experience, maybe some of the internal systems make them super frustrated because they can't do their job, right? Then you need to know what those things are, because if you don't, chances are really slim that you're going to create an amazing experience for your customers, because your employees, quite frankly, just can't do it.
Yeah.
I was on a call once with a retailer because I think they had sent me something and it wasn't working and I wanted to send it back. So I called them over the service line, and the conversation was kind of funny, but also kind of sad, because they couldn't fix the issue on the phone, right? And you know, everyone knows this experience, like, hey, hang on a second, can I put you on hold for a little bit? Let me transfer you over to somebody, and you get more and more frustrated as a customer. And that's exactly what happened. So at some point along the phone call, I said something along the lines of, oh my God, geez, you know what? I'm about to jump out of this window because this is so frustrating. And the service rep on the other end, you know, let go this sigh of relief. And he told me, oh my God, I'll be right behind you. And I started to laugh, and we actually got into a conversation. I was like, well, what are you talking about? And he was like, you know, the reason why I cannot help you is very simple. Like, it's like I'm sitting in front of 5 computer screens and your profile won't pull up, and it takes 2.5 minutes for your data to show up. That's why I need to put you on hold. And then I've looked into your data, but somebody didn't enter all of the details. So he was like, I would love to help you, but I can't. And you see, so those are some of the things we need to identify, because if that happens with me, chances are pretty high it happens to a lot of other customers too. And it collectively makes up for a really, really terrible experience. Yeah. So yes, please, more companies need to look at employee vulnerability. It's incredibly helpful and very, very, very important.
And it's a huge deal. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking that during these tough times, unlike some other places here in Romania, we have quite good delivery service of groceries, you know? And I always have the choice between 2 different brands. I always have the choice. And I always choose one, because no matter no matter who the delivery person is, or the person that's picking up my groceries or whatever, they always call me. They always talk to me and say, hey, I didn't find this, but can I replace it with this? But they're always happy. They always call me and they're happy. And they laugh and they make jokes, and I don't know how they find these people, really. I don't know. I've always wanted to reach out and ask them from a branding perspective. I'm super curious, because I'm incredibly satisfied, like surprisingly so. You know, I sit there and I can't believe that even though it's a different guy or girl every single time, it's like I want to be friends with all of them. I talk to them for two or three times on the phone, and I'm like, shoot, you know, like, you want to come in for a cup of coffee? It's really, it makes all the difference. And even when I have a bad experience, recently I had this where literally my package got lost, like nobody can find it, no idea. But I talked so much, and they were so communicative with me, and I told them I understand, you know, there's some issues with the way postal service works in certain countries. I understand the limitations of where I am, but just the way they talk to you is so nice, and it doesn't feel like so scripted. You know, they're people, they're just sitting there, exactly like the guy that maybe if you're analyzing that recording, maybe he's not supposed to say those things, you know, to you as a customer, right, but he did, and maybe that's exactly what kept you intrigued in the first place, and made you say, oh, you know, it's okay that this issue is happening. I understand. Ironic, no? That they're sitting there and trying to find like all the AI ways possible to analyze what the call centers are doing, but it's removing all of the, I don't know, like the human connection that stems from mutual vulnerability, to your point. It's just, anyways, sorry, I went 100%. Off on a tangent.
No, you see, you can tell by how passionate you get about these things, that it really pays off, you know.
It does. I'm right there with you. I'm a firm believer, which I think is interesting why you guys chose the word vulnerability in the first place. I don't know if there's a story behind that, or if you just want to touch upon why that's the word, because you could have called it so many things, you know, but you guys chose this word that, I don't know, maybe gets associated with a lesser than ideal connotation.
Yeah, we love the word, and we really like it because it's very human, you know. And I think it does go back to the fact that we are talking about people here, you know. I think the one thing we wanted to avoid is, because we're talking about it in the business context, that we use a term that also just feels very business-like, or is very robotic, right, or very analytical. Because yes, we do all the analytics and all the stuff on the back end of that, but the way into this conversation is through a very human lens. Like, we do this for people. It is about, like, I think, you know, Merriam-Webster, the dictionary, defines vulnerability as an ability to be capable of being emotionally wounded. So it's very much the study of human behavior, and we like the tension that word brings into a boardroom or a meeting room from the very beginning, because it sets the stage. And I think it sets it in a very appropriate way. Yeah. And it's important to get that tonality right from the very beginning, because it's the beginning of everything, but it's also kind of like the destination. So it starts with people, and what we end up doing at the very end really is supposed to benefit people as well. So that's part of the reason why we fell in love with the word, and why we use it quite frequently.
And what about, because I gave this example of what I've seen, let's say this year, when everybody's been a little bit more vulnerable than I think we've been collectively in a while. Do you see more or less openness, given what's happened this year, to this kind of discussion with clients, with brands, etc.?
I think so. So it's a yes and no answer I'm going to give you, because I think yes, companies, people are more open to having the discussion, right? Because we are all collectively going through a phase where just humanity is very vulnerable right now. Yeah. And I think people understand that whether you're a business or you work at a company, or if you're employed, like, you're also a person, right? So I think sometimes people have become a little more forgiving with regards to the experiences they have with companies. And the way we've seen that is, we did a really fascinating piece of research where we actually went out all around the world and we asked people about, you know, what makes a brand really human. And one of the main things that people kept saying was, just be authentic and admit that you are flawed as a brand. And that's okay. Like, we don't expect you to be perfect all the time, right? But we expect you to make up for your mistakes, you know, if you recognize that you did something wrong. And actually, that makes you more likable. So there was a massive discussion we had around how admitting and being very authentic about areas where you aren't great, but where you put every effort behind becoming great, really makes you more likable as a brand. And I think, you know, that's why the conversation around vulnerability, I think, is one that people are more receptive for. on the one hand. On the other hand, I will say that because we're all changing our behaviors right now, we're learning how to maybe spend more time online, or how our customer experience is more digitally driven. People also just sometimes tend to be a little less forgiving because, you know, in a situation, for example, where you now learn that you can get your groceries delivered to your front door, because we're all doing it within a day, you become a little less forgiving when you order a sweatshirt and that takes a week to ship and you're being charged $9.99 for it to arrive at your house. And you go, that's not how this works anymore, guys. Like, yeah, right. So you become a little less forgiving because your benchmarks are shifting for what a great experience is. But people are a little more open to just having a conversation around, hey, if you made a mistake and you make up for it, that's actually a great opportunity for us to have a better relationship.
I'm so glad to hear that that kind of stuff comes out in the numbers. You're gonna have to send me the research. I don't know if I've seen it, but I'm glad to hear. I'm glad to hear that, even not because I'm necessarily a stickler for the numbers, but I know that, you know, for a large group of people, if you don't have them, then they just don't listen. So it's nice to see that the numbers are supporting the cause, you know, to a certain extent. To be honest, I had one question that I did want to ask you, just because this came up when we were talking about this topic, and that's NPS, because I mean, Net Promoter Score is kind of like the go-to and what everybody boasts about. And to your point, you know, about only looking at the positive, I'm really curious what your opinion is on Net Promoter Score and using it kind of definitively for you know, evaluating, let's say, customer experience, customer satisfaction.
Yeah. How much more time do we have? Let me see. Jeez. So remember how we started this whole conversation and I asked you a yes or no question about your driving?
Yes. I tried to forget it though.
let me remind you, you know, we talk about vulnerabilities here, so I have to bring it back.
I'm good. I'm good. I'm ready.
I'll ask you another question.
Okay.
Let's say you're a teacher. Would you evaluate a student on the basis of just one test score?
No, God, no.
So if you want to buy a car, would you base your purchase decision entirely on one metric like gas mileage?
No.
Right. That's why you shouldn't be using NPS to the same extent. Like let me.
No, it's a good. No, I like it.
Let me say this. I think I understand why companies use NPS, right? And there is a little bit of benefit to it. It's very simple. You can compare and benchmark yourself against your competitors really quickly. The problem is it's not just simple, but it's unfortunately also just a little simplistic, right? For the reasons we just talked about. It does measure a lot of intent. Like you ask people a question, which is, hey, on a scale from 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend us? So the problem is, if you're a person and you get that question, it normally happens in the context of one interaction. So if you go into a retail store and you do something, you normally get a text message afterwards that says, hey, you just went to our store. How likely are you to recommend us? So they're asking you that question on the basis of one very isolated event or interaction you just had. Good so point. That in itself is very limited. And then it does ask you about intent. Like, would you be able or willing to recommend us? And we know people sometimes tend to be a little kinder and they're like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. But they wouldn't actually, right? Because it's just intent. It doesn't really measure if they actually end up doing it. So there's a bunch of problems with that. I think it was in 2018, the Wall Street Journal, they listened in to all of the earnings calls of 50 of the 500 Fortune 500 companies. And they counted how many times an executive would mention NPS during an earnings call. So it was 150 times. And
holy shit.
Guess how often out of those 150 times an executive mentioned that NPS went down? 0. So 150 times it was mentioned on all these earnings calls and it always went up. So that in itself gives you something to think about and makes you wonder how valid and helpful the number really is.
Oh, that's funny.
So So right, so it's kind of funny. So I get why companies use it. What my belief is, or our belief is, instead of just knowing whether people have the intent to maybe recommend you as a company, that's nice to know. What I want to know is, why wouldn't they recommend you? Why? I want to get underneath the why they would not recommend you, why they would not talk to somebody else about a pleasant experience. Because if you understand the why behind those questions, you can actually do something productive with it. And that's why we believe, or I believe, that customer vulnerability is actually much more helpful than NPS. But I'm a little biased.
Sounds like a good campaign idea. The new metric by which to. I mean, it's not a bad idea.
You've heard it here first, people.
Oh my gosh, Dom. To be honest, I asked all that I wanted, and this is, like I said, this topic, I find it incredibly fascinating. I learn every time from you, because of what you guys are doing. So I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate everybody that's joined today, but mostly you, Dom. Thank you for taking the time, as always.
No, absolutely. Thank you. It's always a pleasure. I'm surprised you keep bringing me back. I'm just rambling for an hour, and then you're like, hey, can you do this again?
How likely are you to recommend? No, I'm kidding. So for everyone that's watching, not only thank you, but as you guys know, we have lives every day, new masterclasses on rebelsrulers.com every day. So definitely check out which ones we have coming up next. There's still quite a bit of time, right? We're still going until December 3rd. So there's a lot more great discussions and a lot more great content. But until then, I guess I say thank you to everyone once more, and have a nice day.
Likewise. Thank you to everyone on Facebook and here. Good seeing you.
Bye, guys. Have a good one.
Thank you, Flavia.
Bye, Dom.
Bye-bye.